Mr Speaker, the acts that we pass in this Parliament serve many purposes. In simple and literal terms, they contain rules outlining what can and cannot be done under law. In a broader sense, the legislation we enact also implicitly reflects South Australia's identity, values and aspirations. The ultimate purpose of these laws should be not just to ensure the smooth running of the state's affairs, but to improve people's lives and to give them the capability to fulfil their potential. This, of course, must apply to all citizens. Where laws reflect and enshrine discrimination, such as through the inclusion or absence of certain words, then Parliament has the means and the responsibility to act. The imperative becomes only stronger when such discrimination leads to the cruel and disrespectful treatment of people, often at times of great sadness and suffering. This is exactly what occurred in January this year, in the wake of the tragic death in Adelaide of British man David Bulmer-Rizzi, who was honeymooning here with his husband Marco. David's marriage to Marco was not recorded on his death certificate because South Australian law did not recognise their marriage. This case highlighted the need for a relationships register, and it brought home to the general public the implications of discriminatory language in legislation and administrative procedures. I want to emphasise that this has not been the only case of its kind. For example, a South Australian man, Andrew Birtwistle-Smith, was not allowed to record the word married on the death certificate of his husband, Christopher Birtwistle-Smith. This was despite the fact he was legally wed in Canada in the mid-2000s and had been married for 11 years before Christopher's passing. Discrimination can be manifested in other ways too. Let's look at a few examples, some of which are from correspondence I've received recently as part of the Make Change Happen campaign for legislative reform. A person like Madeline, who says she was told at a counter that she couldn't change the gender on her driver's licence because, despite how she looks and her having a letter from a doctor, her birth certificate says male. This incident, she says, made her feel utterly humiliated and could so easily have been avoided with a change to the law. People like Chloe and her partner, who are told that they can't access fertility treatment in this state because their inability to have children is deemed a lifestyle choice. As Chloe says, this made us feel as though we were not wholly accepted by our government. Intersex people who suffered from feelings of exclusion from society because in part their status is not properly recognised on documents and ID cards. One person wrote to me saying, "Every time I have to show my ID at a pub or a university, I feel deeply humiliated." Transgender people continue being addressed by Mr, Mrs, Ms in letters from telephone or other public utility companies despite their repeated requests to be called by a title that respects who they are. When our laws discriminate against a particular group of people, it sends a message that this prejudice written into law justifies treating people differently in our day-to-day lives. Such laws don't affect only LGBTIQ community, they diminish our society as a whole. They diminish us by saying effectively that there are certain people who deserve to be treated differently, whose relationships are worthless, whose families should not exist, and are not entitled to the same fundamental rights as their neighbour. People who are not members of the LGBTIQ community recognise this injustice too, and many have written to me to express their support for reform, stating that LGBTIQ people face barriers that they don't, and that this situation quite simply is not fair. We should be building a safer, fairer future for the next generation of children, so they never have to experience the kind of fear and harm that was a reality for people who grew up when homosexuality was a crime. And we should be ensuring that our laws apply equally, regardless of who you fall in love with, who your family is, or the gender you live as. Mr Speaker, our state has a long and admirable history of progressive social thinking and legislative reform, and some of those advancements have occurred in relation to the LGBTIQ South Australians. We're reminded of this on the 10th of September last year, when this chamber marked the 40th anniversary of the passing of groundbreaking legislation under the leadership of the Honourable Don Dunstan. On that occasion, we acknowledged that in 1975, South Australia became the first jurisdiction in the country to decriminalise homosexual acts between consenting adults. As I told this chamber last year, that legislation came in at a time when attitudes to homosexuality were still in many cases extreme. In the 1950s, 60s and even 70s, homosexual men could be sacked from their jobs, kicked out of their homes, disowned by their families and friends, and brought before the courts and jailed for engaging in consensual sex with other men. Such men could also be treated with great brutality and even killed. The drowning of Dr. George Duncan in the River Torrens in 1972 being an horrific and high-profile example. Many members of the state's wider LGBTIQ community were in the public gallery for that parliamentary debate last year about the 40th anniversary, and I'm delighted that today members of the community are once again present to witness and celebrate another milestone. It is right that we recognise historical achievements, but we should always look at what more can be done to address obvious discrimination and bring about tangible, positive change. In line with this contention, the state government released in May 2014 its strategy for inclusion of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, intersex and queer people. That document states that all South Australians deserve a fair go, that they have a right to feel valued and to have the opportunity to fully take part and prosper in the community. It also identifies a series of priorities for action, all of which we're continuing to pursue, and these are social and emotional health and wellbeing, employment and other opportunities, awareness and education, inclusive service delivery, and engagement with the LGBTIQ communities. The state government signalled its intention to address discriminatory language in historical laws early last year. Through the mechanism of the Governor's speech to open Parliament on February 2015, we outlined various measures to make our democracy more inclusive. And we framed these efforts within the context of a simple and compelling question. How can we fight for a more open economy but simultaneously ignore the need for a more open society? In that speech, the Governor announced that we would invite the South Australian Law Reform Institute to review legislative or regulatory discrimination against individuals and families on the grounds of sexual orientation, gender identity or intersex status. The Institute conducted that review. It identified more than 140 pieces of legislation that discriminate on the grounds of sexual orientation, gender identity and intersex status, and it made a series of valuable recommendations. The upshot of the Institute's work was that the government introduced a series of bills into the House of Assembly designed to address discrimination in legislation. And I'm pleased those bills were passed by the House earlier this month, and I very much hope they'll soon be passed in another place. I'd like to put on record the nature and effect of these reforms. Birth, Deaths and Marriages Registration Gender Identity Amendment Bill makes it easier for South Australians to change the gender they are registered as on their birth certificate, in particular by removing the need to make an application to a magistrate for adults. The Relationships Register Bill 2016 allows unmarried heterosexual couples, same-sex couples who are unmarried and same-sex couples who are married overseas to have their relationships legally recognised in South Australia. Changes to the Equal Opportunity Act to ensure that intersex status is formally protected from discrimination under the Act. The statute's amendment surrogacy eligibility bill ensures people can access reproductive treatment if they're unlikely to become pregnant other than through the use of assisted reproductive technology. The bill also amends the Family Relationships Act 1975 to extend access to lawful surrogacy agreements to non-heterosexual couples. The statute amendment Gender Identity and Equity Bill changes the language used in South Australian law to remove gender bias and ensure that gender identities are captured in state legislation. And same-sex couples will now be given the right to adopt a child in South Australia under changes to the Adoption Act, which replaces the definition of marriage relationship with qualifying relationship. This means couples in a marriage-like relationship, irrespective of sex, gender identity, can adopt. Mr. Speaker, I wish to thank all those in the community who advocated for the passing of the legislation. In your actions and in your arguments, you demonstrated unity, energy, thoughtfulness and compassion. And I must say I look forward to meeting a number of you later as we have an afternoon tea after this debate. As for parliamentarians, I particularly want to thank this chamber and especially the member for Raynell, the Assistant Minister for the Premier, Minister Hunter in the other place, the Minister for Member for Port Adelaide, the Member for Colton for their hard work and dedication, and those opposite who also offered their support for the various reforms. The bills have both symbolic power and practical import. They have the effort of validating the existence of the LGBTIQ people, including in the affairs of the state and fully recognising their considerable contribution. The changes provide people with access to services previously restricted or made unavailable to them. And perhaps most importantly of all, they open up opportunities for them to advance in society. Through the legislation and through the wording of the motion before us, this House is making a historic statement of empathy and support. We're acknowledging that all LGBTIQ people are valued citizens of this state and must be treated with fairness and decency. And we're saying in law, difference must no longer translate into discrimination and disadvantage. And we're saying that the wrongs of the past must never be repeated, but that there is still more work to be done. Finally, Mr Speaker, I spoke to, Madam Deputy Speaker, I spoke to a gay man earlier today and asked him what he felt this apology meant to him. And he told me that he grew up in a time when homosexuality was unlawful. And when he was growing up, he couldn't see a future for himself. And that hurt. That hurt him. And so to him, and in particular to the young people that are here today, I especially want to address the young people that are not only in the chamber but perhaps listening to this or may find out about these remarks. I want you to know that who you are is okay, and that you're a welcome part of the broader South Australian community. And today, as Premier and as a Member of Parliament, I formally say sorry to all of you who have suffered injustices and indignities simply because of who you are. And I commend the motion to the House.
Leader.